And we are live. It's another great day at Cribl. How are you doing today, Jackie? You're on mute.
I'm muted. I actually feel a little bit muted today. So I have COVID. So I've been out sick all week. Um, so if you hear a lot of sniffling and coughing, that's why. But I'm all hopped up on Dayquil, so I actually feel I feel
There you
pretty
go.
good
Hey,
right
you know
now.
what?
So I got like a solid 2 hours before I start to feel like trash again.
There you go. You know, you got to find that good feeling where you can when you're sick.
Yeah. And I am unapologetically in my Hello Kitty pajamas because
Hey, you know what? Hey, that could be your everyday. No one would know.
I know, right? That's the great thing about being fully remote.
Yep. Just be stylish. Hey, there you go. Works every day. How's the weather in Arizona?
It's been beautiful. It actually rained last night. And it's funny. This is a place where no matter what time of year it is, if it rains, it's newsworthy. So it was awesome because it's when it doesn't rain here, it's really dusty. And
Mhm.
I've been dusting like twice a day for the last 3 or 4 weeks because it's been so dry. So when it started raining last night, I was like, yeah. And then my dogs
Yeah,
tracked a bunch of mud in the house.
there you go. Yeah, I was in Oklahoma yesterday talking to some prospects and customers, and you could feel the front moving through as all the humidity rolls in and fly to Atlanta. And now this morning, all that same humidity is rolling into here. So it's the joy of the weather.
Yeah. And
Hey,
take this over snow.
there you go. Absolutely. Every day. So we're going to talk about AI today. I'm going to pull up one of my favorite slides that you have. So tell me a story.
All right. So this is kind of when it comes to AI, I think that we need to, and granted, most of the people who are going to tune into this live stream are probably pretty tech literate, so they probably already understand this. But I think it's important to understand what generative AI is and what it is not. And generative AI, in a very, very, very basic sense, is basically just fancy autocorrect, right? So when you're typing into your phone or predictive text is basically saying every time you say I love, the most common thing you say next for most of us is you. Sometimes it's chocolate for me, but like, so it's essentially connecting words with their relationships with other words. And so, when you type something like fuck into your keyboard, it's going to give you this list of the next words it thinks you might be
Right.
saying, and generative AI is really just adding more context to this. So it's looking, and this web that you see there on the graphic is really saying, generative AI is really just moving a few layers out. So it's bringing more context into when this person typically says fuck at this time of day to this person with these other words
Right.
before and after it. So I think to kind of start with a basis for what this is, it's good to understand that we're basically dealing with some fancy autocorrect here. And the important thing about that is that what generative AI can't do yet, I guess I should say,
Mhm.
is create novel ideas or connect dots that have never been connected before.
Yeah. That's
Yes,
awesome.
and yes, Dayquil crew. I was actually telling Ed I put myself into a NyQuil coma last night after a couple fitful nights of sleep. I was like, you know what? I am not better than this. I am taking NyQuil.
Yeah, you got to do what you got to do in order to take care of yourself. That's for sure. And I think you're
Yeah,
right. I think the thing people forget is AI has been with us for a long time. I mean, you what you're talking about, the autocomplete and the text completes have been in something like Gmail or Google Docs or Word forever. But that idea of contextualizing, I think that's the what gets really interesting about generative AI.
yeah, and I think what a lot of people don't know is that you've been helping train generative AI for
Yes.
years. So
Mhm.
these captchas are actually generating or training generative AI. So, every time that you say, this is a cat, this is a cat, this is not a cat, generally the captcha already knew that, but it's helping to verify and provide a feedback loop for those. We're talking about images, but this applies to sound and all of these other things.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think it's a way to look at it, and also the training data set. Where does that data come from? Because I think that is opening up really, really new things that people just never thought about. You want to go into that a little bit?
Yeah, so just to kind of set a basis for how these are called generative adversarial networks. So how these things work is basically you train the generator with all these different, sometimes copywritten
Yeah.
pictures and things, and then you have what's called a discriminator. And so basically the generator says, okay, based on these 20,000 images or 20,000 epochs, which is actually quite a bit more than just an image, that I've run, I know that every picture of a cat generally has these two pointy things and then this triangular thing and then these almond shaped things. And so it says, is this a cat? It says, here's a cat. And then the discriminator says, well, based on what I know, the chances of that being a cat are X%. And it provides feedback on the areas where it doesn't look like a cat. And basically, it's this feedback loop where you get to generally you want to get to where you're fooling the discriminator about 50% of the time, and it's more for more detailed things. But the issue here is that the way that we've been training these things for quite some time
Hmm.
is from the web.
Right.
And almost almost everything on the web, there is a lot of open source stuff on the web, but much of what's on the web is protected by some version of patent, copyright, trademark,
Oh
you
yeah.
name it. And so I think one of the issues here that you've brought up multiple times, and I think is one of your big kind of sticking points with generative AI, is there really, because you're never creating anything that's novel and you're only ever connecting existing dots within the model, the chances of you accidentally using something that's protected in some way are pretty high.
And I would also say it's not accidentally using something that's protected. I think some of this is very quite intentional. And
Yeah.
that's and I think that's because, I mean, for example, if you're going to do image creation, which I think is an incredibly big market, think of how much money you can make to on demand create images. You just, you go to chat GPT and says, give me this, and where's that coming from? And I think that that's from the, you look at the legal models, especially around copyright. Think about Getty Images, probably has one of the biggest image databases in the world. So now you're taking their investments and creating a new investment and not compensating where you got that from.
Yeah. Yeah,
So,
exactly. And
yeah.
so I think, you love to scare me by sending me links to all the new lawsuits.
Right.
There's a couple really really high profile lawsuits that you've sent me over the last couple months that are going to have a huge impact on generative AI.
Right.
And we just recently, and we're not going to name them because
Right. Oh yeah.
because I'm too sick to get a cease and desist letter right now. One of the larger venture capital firms
Right.
just acknowledged that, like, hey, it's entirely possible that if we decide it's not okay to steal copywritten work and dress it up with some extra frills and call it AI generated content, there's a great possibility that a lot of our portfolio companies are probably going to tank in value. So we're starting to kind of come to a reckoning point with this. And I think the Getty lawsuit is the one that we were talking about that has the
Yeah.
potential to have a huge impact.
Yeah. The Copyright Office is doing a review on the position, the posture, what's going to be the go forward. I think that's related to the recent executive orders around AI, where the legal frameworks that the country and the world operates under are going to have to be updated to accommodate these very new and interesting technologies, and finding the middle ground that facilitates creation and innovation, but also protects, for example, existing image databases, your content that's, imagine if you're an author and you've written all these wonderful works, and they get scanned and now your stuff's getting ripped off. I mean, that would
Yeah.
just, it's just, there has to be a middle ground between innovation and also fairly compensating existing content creators.
Yeah, totally agree.
Mhm.
And I think this becomes extremely important when you start talking about. So one of the things I talk about is, like what the promises are for AI and security.
Right.
And when we start talking about having AI write code, that AI has been trained with code from GitHub.
Yep.
And most of the time, when code is posted to GitHub, it's like a whole folder of shit, right? And so there's like the
Right.
actual scripts with the code, and then
Yep.
there's this text file that says licenses
Mhm.
or license agreement.
Right.
And the problem here is that AI is not taking that Python file and then taking that text file and generating something and saying, oh, by the way, 0.02% of this is a line of code that we pulled and this has the licenses. So that's not what happens, right? It just says,
Right.
hey, here's some code. You're like, oh, this is working great. And I mean, realistically, and this is kind of a so I was a data scientist, right?
Mhm.
And I wrote some code that ended up going on to be patented by the company that I wrote it for.
Right.
And I know damn well that code's probably not defensible because I wrote it with a bunch of open source Python packages, right?
Exactly.
So
Right.
Python in particular, because of its use of open source packages, but I mean, a lot of different programming languages are very difficult to, like, I think the IP, intellectual property laws, have not kept up with open source and the
No, not at
internet
all.
in general, right? And
Right.
that, like, you'll be issued a patent basically as long as nobody challenges it. And so you can have companies that have patents on these things for like 15 years. And
Yep.
then all of a sudden somebody comes along and says, hey, half that code is mine. And the patent office isn't actually liable for issuing patents on protected stuff because it's up to the patent holder to enforce their rights, right?
Exactly.
So um, my hope is that I'm hoping that this is going to kind of bring about a reckoning for the entire intellectual property process in general, because
Yeah.
my opinion is that from a software perspective, it's been broken for a really long time.
Yeah, it's broken in a lot of ways, and unfortunately, it protects large companies who can afford enough lawyers to protect themselves and use the system. If you are a small content creator, your ability to if you- your ability to enforce your rights and get notice is very, very difficult. And I completely agree that there needs to be a simpler, more equitable process. That is absolutely for sure.
Yeah, and I think this spans numerous industries. I worked in the music business for a long time, and there are just a couple rights organizations who really dominate enforcing
Yes,
copyright on music. And
it's
it's the same,
terrible.
exactly what you're saying. You have a couple options. One is that nobody enforces your copyright at all, so everybody's out there using your music and you're not getting paid for it, or you sign up with one of these kind of mafia-like rights
Trolls, yeah,
organizations.
exactly.
Yeah, where you essentially are having to give up a piece of your revenue just to secure the rights to stuff that's already yours. And that was what I wrote about after the national cybersecurity strategy came out with a lot of these things. It's like, until we come up with some type of funded, equitable way to enforce rights, it's constantly any regulation is just going to create a haves and have-nots where it's only the wealthy who can protect their intellectual
Exactly.
property and their copyright. So, we really do need some type of way to um, create a funded method for enforcing rights for small companies and creators, because those are really who are getting ripped off the most, right?
I mean, I think your music analogy is great because you see it constantly of how much music is reused, and you have these crazy lawsuits of you just like, oh yeah, you stole my music. And you're like, what? And it's just and you just go back and forth about how it works, and it needs we need something simpler across the because you think about the economy, so much of the economy is based upon intellectual property. And so
Yep.
we need a fair way to do it because I think in the long term it generates better outputs, better outcomes because everyone can participate.
Yeah, absolutely. And like it's extremely important that you're able. So to go back to the music thing,
Mm,
here's a fun fact. Here's your fun fact for today. So
there
I
you
don't
go.
know if anybody is a rap or hip hop fan, but there is a song called Sicko Mode by Travis Scott
Oh
that
yeah.
has some very, very distinctive trombones in the beginning of it. Arby's ended up using those trombones for their new campaign. So you know how Arby's is like, dun dun dun, we've
Uh-huh.
got the meats.
Right.
Those are actually the trombones from Sicko Mode. So Travis Scott is getting paid a shit ton of money
Right.
on this Arby's song. But if he was a small, no-name producer and Arby's had just found his music on their SoundCloud and used this pretty hard to identify sample from it, which happens all the time, he wouldn't be getting paid. And
Right.
so, like, I don't think people realize, same thing with code. Like, there are very small snippets of code that do very big things and everything else around them is just kind of vanilla, but it's those pieces that you really need to protect. And so here's the question though, is that There are, depending on what you look at, in cybersecurity specifically, there's 65 to 70 people for every 100 open jobs.
Right.
Every customer you talk to, they say their number one challenge is staffing, right? And we know that the federal government and its associated agencies and entities struggle even more with that than the private enterprise does. So I think the question really becomes, even if we get to a place where we've decided, like, hey, we need to enforce these copyrights, we need to, how are we going to hire enough people in government agencies who understand what they're looking at enough to really make these intelligent decisions when you can't even find the people to
Right.
write the stuff in the first place?
It's a problem, and unfortunately, the current regime is mostly around incentivizing lawyers to do it for you, and
Yeah,
unfortunately, that incentive leans toward people who can pay.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that brings us to our next topic of discussion, which has to do with whether government agencies uh, have the
Uh-huh.
ability to enforce rules or interpret things at all, right?
Oh, I know. Gosh. And so, hey, one more thing. Can you show our audience your cat use case? Because I think that's awesome.
Yeah,
Yeah. So let me go advance right here. So tell them about the cat because I think this is a great example about training and just to get an idea of the amount of data it takes to do this right.
yeah. So this is so basically an epoch is the amount of time that it takes to go all the way through your training data set once.
Mm,
And you actually can't do it once, you have to do it many, many times. And so this is how we generate cats. So you take a bunch of images of cats, and what you do is you start manipulating things like contrast and white balance, and basically the same ways you would kind of manipulate an image within Photoshop. And when you really manipulate the contrast and the white balance, you can draw out basically outlines of these shapes. So after going through training data 1,000 times, this is the types of cats that our training data is generating. So it's
mm.
like, and you can see they're almost cats. Some of them are a little sketchy. Some of them look like they might be ice cream. Uh, I think there's actually a Twitter account that's like, is it a cat or is it something? I can't remember if it's ice cream or something like that. Um, so here's 10,000 epochs. So here you can start to see that we're getting a little bit finer detail, that some of the kind of like outline around the shape of the face. And then if we go to 20,000 epochs,
There you go. Yeah.
um, do we have that?
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
right there.
So this is where you really start to generate good images of cats. And I think there were about 1 million images in this training data set. So you're talking about 20,000 epochs of 1 million images. So we're talking about like 20 billion or 20 trillion uh, training data points. But here's the thing, this was done on I think it was at a 4080, an RTX 4080 GPU. And this took 18 hours. So if you think about the problem with AI, generative AI, is it is insanely computationally intensive.
Yep.
And then one of the other interesting things is that once something is fully trained, it is almost impossible to make any changes to that training set
Right.
without retraining it, which is another 18 hours and insane amounts of computational power. Um, so these things, there's also a balance, and this is the unfortunate thing about like venture capital and being able to overinvest in things, is that a lot of generative AI right now is being subsidized by larger tech companies.
Right.
So you're being able to use OpenAI, ChatGPT and all these things for free, when in reality these things cost quite a bit of money. So
Yep.
um, I think we're going to need to start to get to a tipping point where even if you're not charging people for stuff, you're telling them how much it would have cost if you did,
Right.
because we can't have people building business models around the idea that generative AI is free.
Yeah, I mean, I think Uber's a great idea. A few years ago, Uber was pretty dirt cheap, and
Yeah.
now that it's off on its own, it has to stand alone. And this is
Yep.
something. Look at OpenAI and how much OpenAI has been subsidized by Microsoft, and the unreal amount of money that is spent on GPUs in order to do this. It's unfathomable how much money is out there just buying these GPUs. It's incredible.
Yeah, and then, we're gonna get to a point, like, a lot of this is being done in the cloud, right, obviously. Some of
Right.
this is smart people are doing it on GPUs locally because it's free, but a
Yep.
lot of it's being done in the cloud. And the reality is, like, it's in, happen to have kind of a pulse on the data center industry. Percentage of data centers that have shifted from just storing content and files and things like that to having to be used for generative AI is insane. And it actually produces quite a bit more heat when you're doing generative AI because you have these things
Right.
running at
Oh
full
yeah.
bore 24 hours a day. So this has these crazy ripple effects throughout the industry, right? You have, we can only build so many data centers. We
Yep.
can only cool data centers so much, and you would not believe the astronomical amount of power and energy and water and all of that that data centers use. So we're going to reach a point of criticality where we either have to make a pretty meaningful leap forward in our computational ability so that we reduce the amount of
Just heat.
um,
Yeah.
heat and computer power, or we're going to have to really scale back the extent to which we're using this stuff.
I think it's really interesting, and I think we'll see. It's a science project that's going on in real time, and
Yeah.
people will adjust. I mean, that's the good thing about it. But we also have to guide with the harm, and that's why I'm glad it's going to be interesting. You see, the EU is putting on some very restrictive policies around generative AI. I think the US is being a little more moderate, but unfortunately, that can change as who's in control politically as well. So it's going to be hard to we're going to continuously try to find that middle ground, not only technically, but also with the existing content rules and how it's managed.
Yeah, and again, like the White House put out some guidelines on AI.
Mhm.
Um, and my comment, I actually one of the comments that I was quoted in a news outlet is essentially like our the Biden
Mhm.
administration's AI guidelines were significantly more kind of equity focused than I
Yep.
expected them to be, which was really
Mhm.
good, but no enforcement mechanism,
Right.
right? And so you think about what would be required to scale all of these different government agencies with AI experts who, and again, you can't even hire and
Right.
the government is going to lose out against private enterprise for hiring talent almost every time because they
Exactly.
just can't pay what private enterprise can.
Right.
And so, and that's not, it's not a not, you have to rely on people wanting to go into the federal government for the right reasons, right? And so I think the question comes up is we can create all the best policies in the world, but if there's nobody to enforce them, people will just not follow them because
Right.
you don't have to, and you and I were talking earlier in a different context about the difference between, check the box compliance and true compliance. And
Right.
you can get to check the box compliance pretty easily. It's like shoving shit under your bed when you clean your room.
Right. Well, I think that's where the private right of suit, because I mean, most of the enforcement mechanisms of the things we're talking about now is that that copyright law gives you the right to sue and a basis to recover and to find damages. And I still bothered by that because it's still going to be the comes with money, and because there's so much money in content protection that's going to still be it's going to be not equitable. I think it's the best way to say it.
Yeah. Yeah, and anything you do to try to automate it, actually we were talking, I had posted a link earlier
Mhm.
this week to our team. I think I posted in our tech channel, but the um Google actually sued two men from Vietnam for weaponizing DMCA takedown
No.
notices. So basically, Google has this mechanism where if you think you found your own protected content being used on Google for some reason or YouTube or whatever, you just file a notice and they'll take it down.
No.
Well, these people are basically being paid by other companies to go out and file fraudulent takedown notices against their competitors and get that content removed. And so, like, the other issue is that if you do try to automate this in some way, how do you prevent people from weaponizing it? Because you either have to default to remove or default to keep, right? So there's only two ways to handle enforcement. Either the default is if you tell us something's wrong, we're going to remove it until you prove that it should be reinstated, or you have to really prove that it should be removed before we remove it. And so Google's tried going, the first way, which is like we're going to remove it until somebody proves it should be reinstated. I think Meta to a certain extent has gone the
Right.
opposite way, where you
Right.
report something on Instagram or Facebook and they almost never take it down.
Right.
So you have to figure out where the balance is between those two strategies and how to
Right.
prevent someone from abusing it.
And especially Section 230 gets involved then too, because then that creates even more conundrum for these giant content companies. I think it's another barrier of entry that if I'm a big content company, it's a big barrier for entry for stopping other companies for coming up in competition because they simply can't afford to handle all these policies and comply. So
Yeah.
I think it's another innovation dilemma because we're going to ask everyone to do these things, but if you're an innovative company that's small and you're coming up, how do you do the same things as Google and Meta slash Facebook and everybody else?
Yeah, and we've seen that with the SEC already. So
Yep.
after the dot-com bubble burst and then the financial crisis, the SEC, Sarbanes-Oxley, we started having all these new regulations around data privacy and all
Mhm.
these new regulations for publicly traded companies. Well, a handful of years ago, the SEC was like, well, shoot, I didn't mean to we didn't mean to make it difficult for companies to IPO, but all of a sudden we've realized that we've made it extremely expensive for companies to IPO. And
Mhm.
so they had to implement this thing they call the IPO on-ramp, which is
Right.
basically this thing that gives companies an extra up to 2 years in some circumstances to become compliant with all of the different
Right.
rules and regulations and all of that required to be a public company. And this is, to your point, we're talking about companies who have gotten to a point where they're going public. So these are
Right.
companies who have millions of dollars, theoretically, millions of dollars in revenue. I
Right.
was also just listening to a podcast about that
Right.
hydrogen trucking company. I can't remember what they were called, Nordic or
Yeah, something like that.
something.
Yeah, talk
Yeah,
about talk about theoretically. It's like,
yeah. So theoretically, these companies
yeah,
who are going public, if they can't afford to comply with all these things, yes, it becomes a burden. And
yeah,
so I think that's where it's important to, rather than just setting regulations, right? We need to have frameworks that people can step into that
mhm,
can be sassified, if you will. And that's a really difficult thing because we're talking about trying to create policy at a national level for companies who are oftentimes doing business internationally,
right,
and so it's just, I don't want to use the cluster word because I use it almost every time I talk, but it's a
yeah.
cluster.
I mean, I'll say it, and this is something I get involved with our banking customers quite a bit, and the level of regulation. Think about so if you're a bank and you have a trading arm, so you're going to be regulated by the SEC, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency, the FDIC. If you're working internationally, then you could be regulated by Canada and the UK, and it just eats you alive. And
FINRA?
so yeah, exactly. Yeah, thank you, FINRA. And so then there's also specialized agencies if you're handling bonds and mortgages, and there's so even more.
Yeah.
The Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And so just there has to be a simpler way to do it because I mean I know a good bit about this and I can't keep up with it. I mean, so you
Yeah.
look at like some of the new SEC rules are on Rule 10 and the updates around the ICS policies are just even more to keep up with. And so it's
Yeah.
just there's just you know always got to keep making it better.
And some of them are not clear enough to comply with. So
I
we
would
were
say
just
hardly any of them are clear enough to comply with. I mean, you read these things and I'm just like, I'm a well-educated person and I don't understand this. And it's
Yeah.
just like, you know?
Yeah, well, and I think, there's even because some of them are very vague, like the SEC's new cybersecurity policy, it actually doesn't even technically go into effect until December 15th. But most public companies are already starting to comply with it
Right.
because that's what you do as a public company.
Yep.
And even that, we're watching companies do things very differently from one company to another with regard to what they disclose and when they
Mhm.
disclose it. Now we've got hacking groups throwing
Oh
companies under
yeah.
the
Hey, let's
bus for
talk about
not
that.
disclosing.
This is my favorite thing I've ever seen. Let's
All right.
tell the story. This is awesome.
All right, so we have this group called Alpha or
Black
Scattered
Cat.
Spider. They're Black Cat, Scattered Spider. They're all kind
Yeah.
of different. My understanding is that it's a bunch of different factions of the same kind of
Oh
central
yeah.
group, and these are the people who are responsible for Clorox and Johnson Controls, the MGM, Caesars, all of these different hacks are basically all coming out of this same group. And so up till now, we've seen a handful of public companies disclose activities by this group and compromising their accounts. Well, they hacked this one company who decided not to disclose the event because they couldn't, according to Meridian Link, which is the company that they
Hmm.
hacked, um, they had not found demonstrable evidence that material information had been
Right.
accessed. And this is the issue, right?
Exactly.
The SEC is like, hey, you have to disclose material cybersecurity events, and you need to disclose how you determine materiality.
Yep.
They didn't say, and here's how you determine materiality. So, and this is one of the crazy things is because we have such disparate tech stacks across companies, the SEC can only make rules that are so granular.
Right.
And so this company's like, well, we didn't think this was material. And also, by the way, they don't have to disclose this because it's not December 15th yet. But uh, so this hacking group filed a complaint with the SEC. And they were like, hey, we hacked this company and they didn't disclose it the way that they were
Right.
supposed
It's so
to.
funny. I like, wow, that's awesome.
Oh, I mean,
You got to give them
hacker
credit. I
goals.
mean, to be original, you got to give them credit.
Yeah. But this actually started to make me wonder whether Alpha is Meridian Link is a publicly traded company. It's a somewhat small company.
Mhm.
And that you have to question what the motivations of this group are, whether they just want to make sure that future victims will disclose so that their name stays in the headlines, because the more infamous you are, the more likely companies are to pay because they're afraid of you. Um, The other possibility for this is insider trading. So, the company, either these hackers either shorted the stock, bought puts on this company,
Mhm.
did something to benefit from the stock price of this company following when they made the disclosure before the hack or during the hack. Um, and then the third option, which I think nobody really wants to consider, is corporate espionage,
Yeah.
right? So one corporation hires hacking group to go after one of their competitors and then
Mhm.
throw them under the bus. And that's really unlikely. I think insider trading is also somewhat unlikely because in a small company that's more thinly traded, it's pretty easy to track down those
Oh
transactions.
yeah, totally.
Um, but but yeah, I mean, it's really fascinating to think about, what are the motivations for doing this, and how does this change the game in terms of weaponizing the SEC?
Oh, I think it's amazing. I think there's one thing that hasn't been considered is the motivations of 16 to 24-year-old men who want to have some fun with it. Because
Yeah,
apparently Meridian Link turned down the ransomware, they wouldn't pay up. And
yeah.
so, this is just kind of a fun way to screw with them. And so this is not from Meridian Link's point of view, it's not fun, but I mean, it just from the hacker's point of view, you know what, we're gonna make some trouble for you. So at least I find it humorous.
Well, yeah, and you
Mhm.
gotta admire scalable content, right? We're content creators. We're all about scalable content.
Right.
And this content
Yep.
can be used for multiple purposes because the next time they hack a public company, they can be like, you want us to tell the SEC?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Like, pay
like,
up or we're going to tell Big Brother on you.
oh yeah, we're gonna tell the world. So as a closeout, I think let's have one more. So the SolarWinds has responded to the SEC's charges of defrauding their investors, and so I thought that was really interesting. You want to go first and comment about that?
Yeah, so SolarWinds, here's a quote from their response. SolarWinds categorically denies the SEC's allegation. Oh, so actually, let's start with what the SEC said. So the SEC said, quote, despite being aware of known cybersecurity risks and vulnerabilities, SolarWinds failed to implement appropriate security controls to protect its systems. As a result, the company became vulnerable to the Sunburst attack, which compromised the software of thousands of SolarWinds customers. And then SolarWinds said in response, quote, SolarWinds categorically denies the SEC's allegations that it lacked adequate security controls prior to the Sunburst cyber attack. The company has implemented appropriate security measures and acted in good faith throughout this period. The SEC's complaint misrepresents SolarWinds' cybersecurity posture and fails to provide any evidence to support its claim. The SEC's allegations are based on a narrow and selective view of SolarWinds cybersecurity practices. The company had a comprehensive cybersecurity program in place, which included regular security audits and vulnerability assessments. SolarWinds also had a robust incident response plan, which was activated immediately upon the discovery of the Sunburst attack, which apparently had been already going on for like 2 years, right?
Exactly.
um, Yeah, this is really, really fascinating. Um, and one of the things that SolarWinds said that I think is pretty, ooh, I lost an earbud, is pretty interesting is they said the SEC didn't actually bring any new information,
Right.
which is true. So nobody knows still to this day, it is not the actual point of point of
Right. They know
compromise is
exactly
not
how it
known for
happened.
the
Right.
SolarWinds. Yeah. And my guess would be that they my guess would be that they had they bought access from somebody,
Yeah.
right? Because again, like,
Or SolarWinds 1, 2, 3, and they just logged in.
yeah,
And so,
yeah. I
yeah.
mean, exactly. So after working in the HVAC space, we've seen a number of companies be
Yep.
compromised through their connected industrial control systems. Like, there's a lot of ways to get into a company. So
Yeah.
it's basically a war of words at this point between the SEC and SolarWinds. And to me, this highlights another real issue,
Hmm.
which is that I think one of the things the SEC needs to do, or some entity needs to do, is require companies to categorize themselves based on the nature of the customers they serve and the data that they handle.
Exactly.
Because if I have an online retailer selling fidget spinners, I'm probably not nearly as high profile a target, or the fallout won't be nearly as bad if I'm hacked and my customer information is compromised,
Hmm.
as if I'm Fiserv,
Right.
who runs the banking data for almost every major financial institution in the country, right? So um, SolarWinds is saying, hey, we had systems in place. And I think what the SEC is saying is based on the kind of company you were and how
Right.
deeply embedded into customer systems you were, they were inadequate. They may have been adequate for an auto parts company. They were not adequate for the nature of the SaaS
Right.
provider that you are.
I think that's a key. That's a key point. It how the hack was done is almost irrelevant in that they're saying that you didn't have good controls in place in the first place, and that you said
Yeah.
you did, and so that's a material. It's basically a material misstatement, and I think
Yes.
that's going to be the. I think that's the focus of, did you have security controls in place? Did you have a security program that you actually paid attention to? It wasn't just as we were saying before, things you say versus things you do,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
I
And I
think
think,
that's the focus.
yeah. And to prove fraud, you have to prove three things, right? You have to prove that you lied
Yep.
knowingly, that your intention was to deceive people. And so, and like intent is always one of the things. And so
Right.
you have to prove not only that, and it was really what we've talked about last week was that the CISO was charged, but the CEO was not.
Right.
So this indicates that the SEC is saying the CISO really understood what was going on,
Mhm.
how bad the security posture was, and not only did he not do anything about it, but actively took steps to deceive, assumedly the CEO. Otherwise, I would assume he would have been charged as well as the board
Right.
about the true nature of the cybersecurity
And I wanna
posture.
point out it's
So,
not just deceive, but an omission is considered the same thing. That you don't
right.
even have to actively deceive them, you can get in trouble for not saying anything at all.
Yeah. Yeah. If you don't disclose information that you should have known should be disclosed.
Right.
Yeah. So I think the real question is going to come. But SolarWinds clapback was basically like the SEC doesn't know shit about security.
Right, and I mean, I'm like, well, you know what? And I think this is also where we've talked about cyber insurance is that we're gonna need third-party frameworks of standards where
Mhm.
you're these are the 37 things. It's just like with the built construction industry. Said, so here's the checklist of things to have a roof for a commercial building in order for it to be safe. And I think the
Mhm.
same thing is going to have to be through insurance and government of here's the standard framework that you have to not only say you're doing, but actually do.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's anecdotally, this is kind of silly, but I I'm in a group on LinkedIn for cybersecurity and AI maturity models and frameworks because
Mhm.
this is something that almost everyone who works in the industry agrees we need. But I get more spam, like malicious spam mail through LinkedIn from that group than any of the other groups.
That's too funny. Yeah, it's an LLM too that's doing it.
Yeah, right? So like, and it's you can tell it's automated, you can tell the whole thing. So it's like, um, this is what we talk about when we talk about the promises and perils of AI and security, is that for
Exactly.
every use case for AI you can think of that's positive in security, there's a way to weaponize that. So
Exactly.
when you
Huge issue.
say, hey, I can create this automated thing that like crawls my software, my code database, and looks for vulnerabilities I don't even know are there. Well, if you have good intentions, that's great, because then you can go fix them. If you have bad intentions, that's not great, because then you can go exploit them. And so it's like this continual double-edged sword of like, and it's honestly, it's what I love. It's the
Mhm.
cat and mouse, like guaranteed job security.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's just, it's a sword
Yeah,
that's sharp on both sides, and just got to be
yeah.
careful. You got to be careful how you hold it.
Yeah, so I think the real challenge for the SEC is, one, how do you recruit and retain credible people where you're not going to have somebody like SolarWinds clapping back that you guys are a bunch of idiots who don't know what you're talking about anyway? And then how do you enforce from a 50,000-foot view policy that needs to manage things at a cellular level almost?
Right.
And that is an extremely difficult hill to climb.
Yeah. One last thing I wanted to mention is, I mean, I think with the SEC, I think it's the right direction. It's going to be tough to work out. But what do you do with the companies that are not publicly traded? A lot of companies, and you see companies that are going private every day, and that
Yeah,
are just as big, as just impactful on enterprise IT and security. And so that, I think that's going to be another thing. How because we've seen it before. A lot of
yep,
companies consider security, a cost center, and their basic view is, we don't have to do good security. We're not going to do it because it's not worth it. And so,
yeah.
you have to then, think through, you know, where does it make sense where to have some standards even for private companies.
Yeah, well, my whole spiel has been that we
Mhm.
need to start dealing with data at the point of creation and at the point of data, because we
Right.
always kind of measure data as the kilobytes it takes up, not necessarily what is the actual data. So if you think about like HIPAA, right? You
Yep.
know that if you are a business that deals in any amount of PII
Yep.
that's healthcare related, you have to follow HIPAA regulations. Financial regulations are very similar, right? We
Right.
have some pretty strict. So I think what we need, I agree with you, and I think what's necessary is that CISA needs to start making regulations on any company handling any kind of data and categorizing them by the nature of the data that they handle, and
Right.
creating specific regulations like HIPAA, like the FINRA regulations, all of those for
Exactly.
different types of company data and customers.
And I think you hit on it. That indicative data is where they can start. So not
Yeah.
necessarily in the realm of healthcare and finance, but just indicative data in general, and
Yeah.
that have some controls, because other countries have done that around indicative data. So that spreads that duty of care and the series of that duty of, you have to have controls in place. You have to account for what you're doing and be responsive.
Yeah. Anything that's intended to be non-public should fall under some type of data categorization and regulation. But
Right.
we've also,
Exactly.
one of our 2024 predictions, spoiler alert, is going to be that data categorization and identification will probably become its own industry next year,
Oh yeah.
because it's so important from things like this through AI. So that'll be something that I'm really watching too.
That'll be a lot of fun. Yeah, I can't wait for that live stream so we can talk through it. Hey, well, Jackie, I know you are sick. You are there. Up there, you go. Just on,
I made it almost the whole time. I
exactly.
thought I was going to get through the whole thing without coughing.
There you go. You got 45 minutes. Hey, if that was me, I mean, I would have been popping cough drops every 5 seconds. So I got to say, you did pretty good. I hope you
Shout
feel
out
better.
I think it's called Maruka honey. So Costco sells these boxes of their cough drops, but they're literally just made out of honey.
Nice.
Best cough drops I've ever used. So if anybody else is dying like I am, I highly recommend those.
Yeah, when I had last had COVID really badly. That's what I was just popping those things. It was ridiculous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm going to bed. Hopefully everybody else is going to sign off and enjoy their weekend.
Absolutely. Hey, feel better. Hey, for our audience, thank you very much. Pavel, Daniel, Jay, thank you for commenting. More always want to have your input, and thank you very much. And for everyone else,
Yeah.
have a great weekend. I hope you enjoyed it, and we'll look forward to talking to you soon. Take care.
Thanks.